it wasn't that long ago, in fact it's within my living memory, that for those of us in Western culture, we kind of, broadly speaking, shared a common story regarding how life worked and what life was about and what was most important and those kinds of things. Like it wasn't in every detail identical, but there was, in general sense, what respect meant, what honour and truthfulness and compassion, all those sorts of things were a shared understanding, and they were things that we aspired to incorporate in our lives because they were broadly considered to be good things, partly because we shared common stories, and stories are the ways that we make sense of our lives. So the stories that we tell other people and the stories that are told to us and the stories that we share together are the primary way that our brains work out and sift what is most important, not just to us but to our cohort, to our community and society. So those things, they're very subtle and they're not often spelt out really specifically, but they're there in the stories that we're telling and hearing and sharing. So I wanted to just raise this with you today, this week, because I wonder what stories are shaping you most. Where's your head at? What are you listening to? What stories are you telling? What's the story of your life? How do you frame that? Where do you think it's going? What's going to be most important in all of that? We get resources for those sorts of stories from various places, and it pays to be aware of where you're getting your story resources from. What are the things that are influencing you most heavily? Now, it won't probably surprise you to hear me put in a good word for some ancient stories that have, I think, stood the test of time. And that's one of the things about ancient traditions. They're not fly-by-night ideas. They're ideas that one generation has thought were so good, they've passed them on to the next generation. And not only so, but the next generations agreed and said, actually, they were pretty good. So they've passed them on as well. And those kinds of stories are particularly useful. You might have family stories. You might have cultural traditions. In Australia, things like Anzac is a big one for us. But also I want to put in a word for religious traditions, and most particularly the tradition that I am very persuaded by, which is the Jesus tradition. Of all the figures in history that help us find a way to do life that is not only good for us but good for everybody else, the story of Jesus is a really helpful one. In the main part because it helps us to focus not just on ourselves but on the giving of ourselves to others, and to discover a richness of being and life that can be found there. One of the tests of a story, I reckon, the tests of its usefulness and how helpful it will be, not just for us but for everybody else, is what if everybody shared my story? Because it's easy to tell a story that's really good for you, but it can be quite self-absorbed. But if everybody did that, if everybody had a story that was good for them but was quite self-absorbed, how good would that be? Well, clue, have a look around you. That's what most people are doing. The thing about the Jesus story is that it flips the script a bit, and it raises to the level of highest priority those things that are good for everybody, so that we're not actually in the centre of that story, which is a great relief, to be honest. And instead there's this notion that some things are eternally good. Some things are worth doing and pursuing even when they're costly. Those kinds of ideas are really helpful, really worth holding on to, really worth being steeped in, and they'll stand you in good stead as you go through life. So I'm just putting a good word in for some classic stories. And you see them echoed in lots of other classic stories as well. Some of the great authors down through history certainly make use of the dynamics of gospel stories and that kind of thing. And we are greatly encouraged and warmed by those sorts of stories. Even the notion of the self-sacrifice of the Anzacs in Anzac Cove, you could tell that story as a hopeless loss, a useless loss of life. But actually, it was a story of bravery and courage under fire. People willing to do whatever it took to save their mates. And whilst the battle was not won, it did create a sense of being part of something bigger that was worth fighting for. And that's a really useful thing. So, your stories. What are you telling? Where are you getting the details from? What's important to you and all of that? And they really do shape you. They really will have an impact on the way you do life, and what joy you find, and where you find it, and all those things. So if you want to talk about that sort of stuff, I'm your guy. Hope university life is settling into a rhythm and that you're doing all right. I'll see you around the college.